Hello, very good morning to you. Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss have clashed over how best to fend off recession, following a stark warning from the Bank of England that the economy will begin to shrink later this year, with inflation set to top 13%. The Tory leadership hopefuls went head-to-head on a special Sky News programme, The Battle for Number 10. Responding to a question from an audience member, the Foreign Secretary said a recession is not inevitable. But the former Chancellor warned that his rival's plans to cut tax could make the situation worse. Our political correspondent, Ali Fortescue, reports.
A decisive moment in the race to be the next Prime Minister, arriving as ballots land on Tory doorsteps.
Foreign Secretary, good evening.
Liz Truss, the undisputed frontrunner.
Hey, Charlie, you're right.
Rishi Sunak struggling to close the gap.
Tails never fails. Do you want to go first or second?
I want to go first, please.
There we
Kay.
go.
An early victory for the Foreign Secretary, but under the studio spotlight with more than 60 mostly undecided party members, the tough questions began.
The Bank of England have said that a recession is inevitable. What can you do to mitigate the impact of this?
Well, what the Bank of England have said today is, of course, extremely worrying. But it is not inevitable. We can change the outcome and we can make it more likely that the economy grows.
And on the Foreign Secretary's first big stumble this week on public sector pay, an admission but no apology.
Liz, why did you announce a well-researched and fully costed policy in which you openly said you valued the work of teachers, nurses and police officers in Newcastle, where I work, less than you value those in Guildford, for example? Why should we trust your judgment?
Immediately, as there were concerns expressed about this policy, I said we're not going ahead with it.
And from policy to personality, quick-fire questions no politician wants to misjudge.
What's the naughtiest thing you've ever done?
I'm certainly not going to say that on TV.
Oh, was it that naughty?
Well, my daughters are watching, so I don't want them getting any ideas, Kay.
Yeah. Is there anything that you feel that you would want to come clean with the audience here in the studio and at home?
Because there's no one else listening, so it's all fine. I can just tell.
Anything that you need to get off your chest?
I can tell you, Kay, there are no skeletons in my closet.
Liz Truss wants to be seen as a candidate to change the course. Her own path, though, hasn't run straight.
You were a Remainer, and now you're not. You supported Brits to fight in Ukraine, then you didn't. You wanted to build on the Green Belt, and now you don't. You wanted to abolish the monarchy, and now you don't. You wanted to arm Taiwan, and now I'm not sure if you're saying whether you do or not. You wanted civil servants...
we do provide them with those
You wanted
facilities.
to cut civil servants' pay in the regions, and then you said you didn't. Will the real Liz Truss please stand up?
Okay, yes, I have, developed my views. I've considered things differently, and I also listen to people.
Okay.
And I think that's important.
Hi, Kay.
Have a seat.
Brilliant.
Then came the turn of the former Chancellor.
Is there a point that you would stand aside in this campaign?
The quick answer is no. And that's because, well, thank you.
And Rishi Sunak hasn't been forgiven by many in the party for turning on Boris Johnson.
You knife in Boris for your own interest.
There you go.
Good of the country.
Right. It's simply impossible for a Chancellor and Prime Minister not to be on the same page when it comes to economic policy.
You've been campaigning for a long time, and it was perfectly timed, a cynical motivation to try and get you into number 10.
No, so that's just simply not true. So I was due to give a speech with the Prime Minister the next week, and in the conversations about putting that speech together on the economy, it was clear our differences were too big to reconcile.
Okay.
So that was the reason. Plus, I think let's not look at the boss with rose-tinted spectacles here. Everyone remembers what was going on with Chris Pincher.
Yeah. How will you balance the need to address the escalating cost of living crisis, particularly for those that are on lower incomes, alongside the need to keep the economy in good order?
The lights on the economy are flashing red, and the root cause is inflation.
And then from economics to a rare test on foreign policy.
On the conflict in Ukraine, Boris Johnson has really thrown himself into the cause. I think everybody might agree with that. He's regarded as a hero, apparently, in Ukraine. That's what he tells us. He brandishes his missile launchers. We've seen that. Are you really tough enough to stand up to Vladimir Putin?
Yes, I'm tough enough, and I'm already delivering the measures that are actually causing him the most trouble. Thank you.
And the applause kept coming for Rishi Sunak.
People feel that you can't walk a mile in their shoes because you're walking in your Prada shoes, what would you say to them?
I think the British people judge people by their character and by their actions, not by their bank account. Thank you.
The ballots will decide the next PM. Last night, just a show of hands.
It looks to me as though Mr Sunak convinced you far more than Ms Truss.
He may have won the room, but this is still a divided party.
I think I'm going to go with Liz Truss. I think Rishi did a pretty good debate.
I came here intending to vote for Liz Truss, barring anything major, and nothing happened to dissuade me. I'm very confident in my vote for Liz Truss.
I think I'd be voting for Rishi Sunak. His answers at some points when he was asked to be short was short. He was clear, he was concise.
Rishi Sunak delivered on detail, but not the knockout blow he needed. Voting's underway, and it is the Foreign Secretary who remains on course for Downing Street. Ali Fortescue, Sky News.
Well, let's get some analysis and reaction to last night's programme. The Conservative peer and pollster, Lord Robert Hayward, is here with me. A very good morning to you. Going into the show last night, Rishi Sunak needed a big performance, didn't he? The polls were not in his favour. So did he manage to pull off a big moment?
Big is possibly a slight exaggeration, but there's no question in my mind, and the vote of the audience, it was the first time that he had clearly led in a debate. And Kay got the audience to vote, and there was no question. She described it as a clear majority for Rishi.
Well, that's interesting. And Liz Truss similarly went in needing at least a safe performance. She didn't want to shift the dial at all. So did she manage that?
Oh, there's no question. She did. She's improved from the first debate where she appeared incredibly wooden and got the lowest ratings. She's improved enormously, comes across well. But the issue that dominated last night was inevitably the Bank of England report, the increase in interest rates, and that played to Rishi's strengths. And I think that's probably what impacted on the audience.
That's interesting that you say that, because some people might say, well, we associate Rishi Sunak with being in charge of the economy for the last 2 years. You might argue that it would count against him.
Yes, I thought that he would have some difficulty in that field, but there was a sense which was conveyed in the audience and their reaction, both on that issue and on others, that he had a grasp, almost as steady as she goes, rather than let's not take a risk at this point. And it was markedly different from previous debates.
And were there any particular moments, for good or for bad, that will stick with the people who are voting for these two leaders?
I think Liz has the problem. It came up in a question from the audience and then was repeated as part of the series of questions to Liz about things she changed her mind on. And that is this pay for people in the North and the Midlands in terms of being a nurse or a policeman. And I think that's going to keep coming back because she wasn't willing to say it was a mistake. What she said was it was interpreted incorrectly. In other words, it's other people's fault. And that didn't resonate well with the audience.
Well, yes, she was challenged quite hard on that, wasn't she, by Kay Burley. Do you feel that she didn't give an adequate response then? Because she just did say, we're not going ahead with this, so why do you keep asking me about it?
I'm judging the reaction of the audience rather than my own perception. And listening and watching the audience reaction, one just felt that she didn't deal with it in the same way that one might have done.
And in the same way, why do you think that Rishi Sunak did particularly well last night? Was it solely because there was such a focus on the economy because of the day's news?
I wouldn't say it's particularly well, but he did better than Liz. And I think there's a sense that this was the first time he'd actually got the better of him. And it was what one might describe as the wild forecasts of 13% inflation and a recession and all these sorts of things that he could, as you asked just now, have been in difficulty. But there was a sense that he conveyed the message better so that the message was got across by Rishi in a way that it hasn't been previously.
And yet there's a sense of optimism coming from Liz Truss, isn't there? She was keen to point out, when asked about the Bank of England's predictions, she said recession isn't inevitable. There is the possibility to turn things around. I mean, is that something that people want to hear? They want to feel that there could be a better way?
I think until yesterday with the Bank of England, and it's pretty dire forecasts, there was probably a sense that the population at large was willing to go down the path of, well, there is an alternative. But I think the messaging yesterday, and it's been coming from the European Central Bank, from the Fed in the United States, is the world, the free world, is in a difficult set of circumstances. And somebody who, with confidence, can answer the questions, as Rishi appeared to, and as one of the audience said on that clip, briefly, succinctly summarise where we are, I think that was persuasive.
And last time you came on this show, you talked about the impact that programmes like this can have, that debates and interviews, big interviews with the candidates can make on the end result. Do you feel that things have changed? What kind of impact do you think they've made?
Liz has had the best of the last few days, no question about it, with the series of endorsements from different major personalities. I think what happened last night was there was a stop in terms of the momentum in one direction. It won't necessarily have reversed it, but there will be this morning a different sense of messaging that is around. The first question to Rishi was, it's inevitable, you're going to lose, why don't you withdraw? And I think probably by the end of that session, one understood why he's not withdrawing, because he had actually got some of his messaging across. But Liz has done well in the previous few days.
And it's interesting timing, isn't it? Because I think the ballots are arriving. Some of the people in the audience had them, some hadn't, most hadn't. But it's crucial timing at the moment.
Oh, absolutely. And to that extent, that has worked in Rishi's favour, because the momentum was with Liz, no question about it. And had the ballots arrived a few days earlier, people would have completed them. I haven't received mine. People I've been speaking to yesterday evening hadn't received theirs. So it is absolutely crucial.
And we keep talking about this poll lead that Liz Truss has. Rishi Sunak's supporters would say that's not what we're witnessing. When we go out and about, we're witnessing much more support than's reflected in the polls. I mean, what's your sense of what's going on?
My sense is that the polls are right up to a point, but you had the audience response last night, and remembering that they were an audience from all over the country. So there have been a lot of undecideds, and I think you may have got a fair amount of them, or them reflected in the audience last night. All the polls, although the number of undecideds has been diminishing, I think the audience last night conveyed a message from the undecideds largely.
Lord Robert Hayward, always very interesting to get your take on things. Thanks so much for coming in this morning. We appreciate it. So we did speak to some of the Tory party members in Crewe who were undecided at the start of the programme to gauge whether anything that was said by the two candidates had won them over. So who was most in touch with the needs of the North was a key issue for them, and it did seem that Liz Truss came out on top. So let's listen to their views.
And we actually want levelling up to no longer just be a term and actually be a real thing. And I think Liz Truss is leaning towards more honesty about actually, I'm going to do X, Y and Z to make your life easier.
It is a real difficult one here. It is really difficult, and, you know, I suppose I am swaying towards Liz.
She was educated in the North. She's much more in touch with what Northern voters hold dear than Rishi.
I will definitely be leaning towards Liz Truss, yeah, definitely.
Well, let's bring in our political correspondent, Rob Powell. So we heard from some of the Tory members in Crewe, largely backing Liz Truss after last night's programme, but the audience there backing Rishi Sunak. Is he gaining, though, a bit of momentum, do you think?
It feels like what was happening there is mirroring what Rishi Sunak's campaign team have been saying for the last week, as these big name endorsements have come out in favour of Liz Truss, and the polls have generally been pointing in massively in favour of Liz Truss as well. They are saying, look, the people that we are talking to on the ground, we feel like we are winning people round and we are persuading people. And the strategy for the last week from Rishi Sunak has been that. There have been fewer sort of big media appearances and more of kind of going around to associations. Last weekend, I think he was at 6 associations in one day, trying to talk to as many Conservative voters as possible and persuade them and win them round. The big unknown is whether he can do that to the extent that he can change so many minds through programmes like the Sky News debate last night, through constituency visits, that he can start to sort of fight against the kind of overwhelming, almost Tory instinct at the moment that seems to be going towards Liz Truss. Now, The second thing I think that will be interesting to see how it plays into this are these dire warnings that have come out from the Bank of England yesterday about spending the much of next year in recession, about where inflation and where interest rates are going to go. And I think the point that Lord Hayward was making there is very interesting. Whether people put that together with the pitches from Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak that are very, very different, there is a definite choice here, and whether they decide that actually, given those dire, pretty fragile circumstances, they want to go for someone that maybe has the experience in the Treasury and that is coming across maybe as a bit more sensible, a bit more steady as she goes, and not take the risk with Liz Truss? Or does that sort of instinct hold that we want to try something new, we want to roll the dice? I think at the moment that's unclear. I don't think there was any disasters or absolute triumphs from the debate last night that will shift the dial to the point of putting Rishi Sunak back level instantly. But I think over the coming days, how those performances last night and the backdrop of the Bank of England warnings combine will be interesting to see whether Liz Truss can keep that momentum that she's generated over the last week, or whether, as ballots start to drop, Rishi Sunak is able to change minds quietly in the background and sort of get people to come round to his way of thinking, especially because of the really, really worrying year that we've all got ahead of us.
Yeah, that potentially changes things, doesn't it? Let's see. Rob, for the moment, thanks very much indeed. So do stay with us. Still to come on the show, I'm going to be speaking to the Business Secretary and Liz Truss supporter Kwasi Kwarteng after that stark economic warning that Rob was just talking about from the Bank of England. And the former International Trade Secretary and Rishi Sunak supporter Dr Liam Fox will be with me soon after 8 o'clock. And the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary Jonathan Ashworth will be with me for Labour. So yesterday saw the biggest rise in interest rates for 27 years and a warning from the Governor of the Bank of England that we're in for a long recession. So there was a prediction that inflation could rise as high as 13.3%, largely as a result of rising energy prices. Now, to counter that, the base rate of interest has been raised to 1.75%. Now, that's an increase of 0.5 percentage point. The reality is the UK could experience 5 consecutive quarters of recession. That's equivalent to 15 months from the final quarter of this year. And that GDP could fall by as much as 2.1% from its peak. Well, speaking to Sky News, the Governor of the Bank of England explained why they're raising interest rates. Well, Ashna Hurinag joins me now from a high street in South London. So a big jump in interest rates at a time when people are struggling with the cost of living, Ashna.
Economists are predicting that the price cap could rise to £3,500 a year for people, which is a staggering figure that for so many people across the UK is simply going to be unaffordable. Not only are people at the moment struggling to pay their phone bills, but they're struggling to fill up their cars, not to mention the spiralling energy costs that we're also seeing on top of this. If we take this high street, for example, all of those costs do radiate down into places like this. On this particular high street, you've got a fish and chip shop next to a cafe, next to a fishmonger's. And all of those businesses independently are going to struggle with this cost of living. If we take the fish and chip shop, for example, if we look at their stock, if the cost of their batter or their fish goes up, that cost has to go somewhere, even if it's going up incrementally, only by a few pence. That is translated down to the consumer, and people are therefore going to be spending less because of rising costs elsewhere. And we know, though, that one of the biggest dividing lines in this leadership contest is tax cuts. Liz Truss said yesterday that recession she didn't think was inevitable, despite what the Bank of England has been saying. She said that she would cut taxes as soon as she got into office from day one, leading some to question whether that would ramp up borrowing. On the other hand, you've got Rishi Sunak, who, former Chancellor up until 3 weeks ago, and was in that Chancellor's hot seat in charge of the public purse up until 3 weeks ago, and was in charge of it for 2 years. Now, he said that that's not the answer, to do that immediately, to cut back costs on taxes. What she suggested is cutting VAT off energy bills. Yes, that would benefit people in the short term, but long term is what people are really going to be caring about. It's no secret that people are struggling not only to pay their household bills, but also with the amount of money they have at their disposal to spend on materialistic things, but things that people need to keep themselves going. There's no doubt, Anna, that the cost of living crisis is going to be an unavoidable issue in this contest.
Indeed. Ashna, thanks very much indeed for that. Let's take a look then at some of the day's other headlines now. And the parents of Archie Battersbee are expected to find out this morning if they can move their son out of a London hospital and into a hospice. Their plea to let him die with dignity comes after a series of courts sided with doctors saying that his life support treatment should be switched off. The 12-year-old has been in a coma since April. Sir Keir Starmer has been found to have breached the MP's code of conduct 8 times. The Parliamentary Standards Commissioner says the Labour leader failed to register interests on time, including gifts from sports teams and the sale of a plot of land. But she adds that these breaches are minor and there was no deliberate attempt to mislead. More workers will join nationwide rail strikes later this month. Unite says its members working for Network Rail as electric control room operators will join other unions in taking action on the 18th and 20th of August. Another strike is planned on the 19th of August by RMT workers on London Underground. President Biden has described the sentencing of US basketball star Brittany Griner as unacceptable. The 31-year-old has been convicted of drug possession and smuggling in Russia and sentenced to 9 years in jail after police found cannabis oil in her luggage. A prisoner swap was proposed, which could have resulted in Griner's release, but it was refused by Russia. Police have released the identities of 4 Vietnamese nationals who were believed to have been in a mill when it caught fire. Specialist officers began searching the mill in Greater Manchester after human remains were found by demolition workers last month, following a blaze 2 months ago. A hosepipe ban is coming into force in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight today after one of the driest years on record and ahead of another predicted heat wave. The hosepipe ban in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight is the first in the area since 2012. There's already one in place on the Isle of Man. And one is due to come in next Friday in Kent and Sussex. Plus, at least 2 other water companies are warning they may have to bring restrictions in affecting areas including London, Surrey and Devon. State employees in many parts of Iraq have been given a day off work as temperatures rise to above 50 degrees in several areas. The heat has seen at least 10 provinces suspend work for most state employees as the heat wave in the country has been ongoing since mid-July and is forecast to continue. Meanwhile, in Germany, repeated explosions at an ammunition storage site prevented firefighters from reaching a forest fire in Berlin. Around 100 firefighters attended the fire, but were unable to get within 1,000 metres of the flames because of a series of explosions triggered by the heat. So with parts of the world experiencing extreme weather conditions, let's take a look, shall we, at the impact of climate change on the planet and take a look at our data dashboard. On the right-hand side, you would normally see how our power mix is made up, how UK's power is currently being produced. Those figures not feeding in at the moment. We'll try and get that sorted for you. But let's take a look in the meantime at how much warmer the Earth is now than around the time of the Industrial Revolution. That's 1880 when records began. And as you can see, that number currently is 1.24 degrees. That's the state of global warming, but that number is ticking up. And at the bottom left-hand corner is the total number of CO2 emissions in millions of tonnes. Now, Taiwan's premier has condemned Chinese live-fire military drills taking place around the island this week. The drills follow the visit to Taiwan of high-profile American politician Nancy Pelosi, which China has called a provocative act. Beijing has defended the missile launches, while the United States has appealed for calm. Well, joining me now is the international editor at Taiwan Plus, Divya Gopalan. So get us up to date with the very latest state of play in the aftermath of Nancy Pelosi's visit, Divya. What kind of reaction have we had from China?
Well, that's right. Here in Taiwan, people are watching these developments very closely, and the Ministry of Defense have sent out warnings as a number of missiles from China have actually crossed over Taiwan. They said they were monitoring those closely, as it was not going to land on Taiwan territory or waters. Instead, what it did was land in Japan's economic zone, which Japan has lodged a complaint against Beijing that those waters are seen as part of Tokyo's. So this is seen as something that's not just that affects Taiwan. It is something that will have repercussions in the region. Now, the Ministry of Defense has said that they are preparing for war, but they will not instigate a conflict. They do not want war. They're closely monitoring the enemy situation. That's language normally used when other foreign forces which have breached territorial lines have defied warnings. They've called China highly provocative. So what does that mean for people on the ground here? Well, if you walk around the streets of Taiwan, it seems like business as usual, but people are actually quite nervous. They're used to this kind of language from China. They're used to this kind of provocation, but they say not to the scale where the main island has virtually been surrounded. Flights have been disrupted, shipping routes disrupted. And people we spoke to here say that there is a sense of worry and anxiety. And if it's any indication, the most downloaded app at the moment is the app that shows you where the closest air raid shelters and bunkers are to your location and the capital. So there is that sense that people are feeling that they need to monitor what's happening carefully and be prepared.
Divya Gopalan, thanks very much indeed. Now let's get some more reaction to last night's special Sky News leadership programme. Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss clashed over the economy after that stark warning of spiralling inflation from the Bank of England. So let's get the reaction then of the Business and Energy Secretary and Liz Truss supporter, Kwasi Kwarteng. A very good morning to you.
Hello, very good morning.
Good to see you. So let's start with that Bank of England prediction that we heard yesterday. They said that households are going to suffer their biggest squeeze on income on record. The economy is going to suffer a year-long recession and inflation is going to hit 13.3% this year. Could this have been managed differently?
I think the problem we have is very simple. I think we've got inflation, which is, as you say, squeezing people's incomes. But we've also got a rising tax burden. And that's why I'm supporting Liz Truss. I've never understood why, if we're going to help people, how we're going to help people by putting up their taxes, especially when their daily shop, their costs are going up. And what's very clear to me from what the Bank of England said yesterday is that more of the same, just simply carrying on with our economic policy at the moment, is not going to cut it. It's not going to help us get out of this difficulty. And actually, the IMF only 10 days ago predicted that we would be the lowest growth G7 economy. And we can't tax ourselves to growth. And everyone understands that. Everyone around the world, nobody's saying we're going to help our people by putting up taxes. Okay. But that's what we're doing in this country.
So it's interesting that you're putting the blame on Rishi Sunak's tax rises.
Yeah.
And yet the Bank of England were explicit about where the rise in inflation came from. They say it's rising energy prices. They largely blame the actions of Russia for our economic problems. So is it fair to blame Rishi Sunak?
I'm not blaming the tax rises, but put very simply, you've got a world where prices are going up. So people's people's energy bills are all going up. So that means their real incomes are being squeezed. Now, to say to people, your real incomes are being squeezed and I'm going to put your taxes up, I think it's just adding insult to injury. You're not actually dealing with the problem. And the way to deal with the problem is to have a slightly looser fiscal approach. And that's what Rishi himself implied yesterday. He said he would help people. Now, if you're going to help people and have an intervention, that is a looser approach than simply hiking up taxes to a 70-year high, which is where we are today.
OK, and I want to come on to what we do about it in the future and what could be done for the poorer people. But I do want to get to the bottom of why we've got to where we are now. I mean, what do you think of how the Bank of England has handled this? Do you feel that they should have raised interest rates earlier?
So there is an argument, and I think it's a strong one, to say that inflation was an issue that was identified at the beginning of last year. And in fact, I think people, Bank of England commentators, even people in the Treasury were saying that this was an issue. And the job of the bank was to deal with the inflation. They've got a 2% inflation target. That's actually their mandate. And now inflation is hitting double digits. So clearly something's gone wrong. And I think there is an argument to suggest that rates should have probably gone up slightly sooner.
So is the Bank of England fit for purpose?
I think, look, to say that it's not fit for purpose, I think is wrong. I think it's a good institution. I think it's worked well. But we need to look again at what the mandate is and how best they can actually fulfil that mandate.
What does that mean?
Well, that means that if your target is 2% and you're predicting 13%, something's gone wrong, and you've got to look at how the bank is organised and what the targets are.
Will it keep its independence under a Liz Truss government?
I think it's absolutely going to keep its independence. But
so how would it change? How
if
would
you
the
have a
mandate
target,
change?
Anna, if you have a target that's 2% and you're predicting 13%, something's gone wrong. Something's gone wrong. It's a hugely missed target. You've missed your 2% target.
And that's not because of global factors like
There were lots
Russia's
of
war
global
in Ukraine.
factors, but people have been talking about inflation for the last 2 years. And I think there is an issue about how the bank is operating, because clearly, if I say to you 2% is your target, and you say to me, well, actually, it's going to hit 13%, I would quite rightly say something's gone wrong. We've got to look at how you're performing.
So something has gone wrong. I mean, this is an economic crisis, isn't it? So
I think it's a global crisis compounded of two things. Firstly, of course, we had the COVID pandemic. Large parts of the world, the advanced economies, were shut down. And then all of a sudden they opened and there was huge amounts of demand and the supply couldn't keep up with it. So that forced prices up. And then on top of that, you've got the Russia-Ukraine crisis, which actually had a knock-on effect on energy prices because Russia essentially is turning off its gas supply to Western Europe. So those two factors have put a lot of pressure in the system. And Rishi was right. It's the tax rises themselves didn't cause this. But to have tax rises in this context, I think is very odd.
OK, so an economic crisis then. So where's the Chancellor?
The Chancellor of the Exchequer is always available, and he's someone who...
We didn't hear from him yesterday. This grim warning from the Bank of England. I mean, is he on holiday?
I'm in contact with him. I've just spoken to him on WhatsApp this morning. He's completely abreast of what's going on. I'm the business secretary. I'm here. I'm in your studio. I'm in a suit. I'm not on holiday. And we're absolutely focused on trying to deal with this problem.
Where's the Prime Minister as well? I mean, some people might be saying we've had this terrible outlook for our economy. There are a lot of people who are suffering right now, not to mention in the future. We thought we might see our leaders at a time like this.
Well, I'm the business secretary. I'm here. I'm in regular contact with the Prime Minister and Chancellor. They're completely on top of what's happening.
Let's take a look then at how individuals are coping with this. We heard yesterday that the energy price cap's going to be reviewed every 3 months and every 6 months. Do you welcome that, or do you worry at all about individuals who'll now see prices rise in October and January at a time when they want to be able to keep the heating on?
I think it's a real problem, and I'm sure that a future Chancellor and the future Prime Minister, whoever he or she is, will address this very, very quickly. The reason for having 3-month reviews is that with 6-month reviews, you had very steep increases, and that was very, very damaging as well. But clearly there's an energy problem. I mean, all over Europe, they're rationing gas. They've got to reduce their gas consumption by 15%. We're not doing that in the UK, but it's an issue that has to be addressed. And Rishi himself, I thought very rightly, said we're going to have to intervene. So even he, who's saying that we've got to keep taxes high, suggests and understands that there has to be some more help to support people. OK,
well, let's talk about what Liz Truss will do to support people rather than Rishi Sunak. Last night, she was given a specific question about a woman's situation, a woman called Selina, earning just over £10,000 a year. She's not going to benefit from the scrapping, the rise in the national insurance that Liz Truss is promising, and the green energy levy, which she's going to cut, will only take £150 off her monthly bills. So she didn't seem to be able to answer this question. I mean, is enough...
I think she answered it very well.
So remind us of what is being done for Selina.
Was that the big risk to this economy is a recession, a really damaging recession. And what happens in a recession is that businesses go bust, unemployment goes up, and growth craters. So that means there's a huge risk to jobs, huge risk to people being able to earn a living, and that situation is going to be disastrous for all of us. And that's why what Liz is saying is that we can't simply continue on the path that we're on. We can't simply pretend that more of the same is going to work, because it frankly isn't.
OK, so that's looking to the future, and we can argue about the rights and wrongs of that. But for people like Selina right now, there's a real need. What's the immediate help that people like her are going to get from a Liz Truss government?
So I'm not going to prejudge what a future chancellor is going to say in a month, or what whoever the Prime Minister is.
And yet you're laying out other policies.
I can't say, because as you say, it's an immediate ask. Liz has said there's got to be an emergency budget. I think she's the only one of the candidates who said there'll be an emergency budget. And in that emergency budget, I'm sure there'll be immediate relief. And actually, the way that Liz is talking about the economy is we need immediate support now. That's why she's talking about tax cuts. That's why she's talking about allowing people to keep more of their hard-earned money. The Rishi plan was for a tax cut at the end of the next Parliament, which is 2029. That isn't going to cut it. That isn't going to help people like Selina who have faced immediate, urgent problems.
Well, you'd agree, wouldn't you, that inflation is the big problem here? I mean, the Bank of England's saying it's going to reach as high as 13% by the end of the year. And you will also know that there are a lot of economists who are very concerned about tax-cutting plans in this kind of scenario. They worry they're going to be even more inflationary and we'll end up with...
So no economist I've ever heard of says the way to deal with a recession is to put up interest rates and to squeeze what they call fiscal policy, to put up taxes. So if you're facing a recession, to face a world where interest rates are going up and then you're putting taxes up on top of that is not helping growth. I mean, that's obvious. No economist is arguing for that.
Well, can you explain to me why the government says that matching pay to inflation is itself inflationary because it puts more money in people's pockets, why cutting taxes doesn't have the same effect because it puts more money in people's pockets?
So I have never believed that the way to deal with a recession when you're putting up interest rates went up yesterday by the largest amount since 1995. That's 27 years ago. So on top of that, to put up taxes on people, I think is perverse. It's not a way to deal with a recession.
How do you think Liz Truss got on last night?
I think she did well.
In the programme. The audience seemed to favour Rishi.
Yeah, I think Rishi was very fluent. He was very slick. He performed at the end. I think he did make an impact. But I think what he said, which was essentially more of the same, taxes are at a 70-year high, but I'm going to put them up. I mean, he didn't say it that, but that was the implication of what he said. I think is completely the wrong approach. And that's why I think it's very important that Liz wins, so that we can actually have a different approach. More of the same is not going to work.
Any lessons learned for Liz Truss's team after last night? Anything that you do differently next time if she was in a one-to-one interview or debate?
Well, I've always felt that it's always good to come second, because that's the impression that you leave. But that was due to a coin toss.
You mean timing-wise?
Timing-wise, yeah.
She won the coin toss.
I know, and she went first. But that was the only thing I thought. I thought she gave a very good account of herself, and she made a clear point, which I think a lot of viewers, certainly at home, recognise, is that we cannot simply carry on as before. We can't deal with a recession by putting up people's taxes to a 70-year high. That doesn't make any sense at all.
OK, Kwasi Kwarteng, we appreciate your time this morning. Thanks very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you.
Now, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival has had a tough couple of years. It was cancelled in 2020 because of the pandemic and downsized last year due to COVID restrictions. But it's finally back and the first events are kicking off today. And our arts and entertainment correspondent, Katie Spencer, is in Edinburgh for us this morning. And, Katie, there must be a pretty excited mood there in Edinburgh. They've missed their Fringe Festival for a couple of years, and now it's back.
Yeah, they have definitely missed it here. I mean, you wouldn't tell on the Royal Mile at this time of day, but actually things are feeling like they are back to normal after a very scaled-down event last year. Things are returning to how they were, and I'm joined. We've managed to drag a comedian out of bed at this time of hour, which isn't an easy thing. Olaf Falafel, you're joining us now here on the Royal Mile. How are you feeling about the fact that the Fringe is back to normal?
Oh, I'm really pleased the Fringe is back to normal. Not so pleased that I'm woken up at this time of the morning, but no, it's great. It's good fun. Had my first show yesterday.
I was going to say, you're a busy man. You're doing two shows, a kids' show and an adult show.
I'm doing a kids' show, mainly because I have a book, which I'm not allowed to plug, but there it is. It's called Trixie Pickle Art Avenger, so I'm getting kids to draw bum-faced snails.
Because you are both artist and comedian, we should say, and a man of many pockets. Show us your flyers. Your flyers.
Hold on a second, let me get these out of the back pocket there. So my show is called Stoat, and I always like to do a little animated flyer, so I don't know if you can see on the back there, it's a flick book of two dancing dung beetles and a bouncing ball of dung poo. for no reason other than it amuses me.
Now, we have to say, you're very coyly saying you can't possibly remember your 2019 joke of the year that you won last time the Fringe was at its height. Come on, what was the joke that you won for?
It was, I keep randomly shouting out broccoli and cauliflower. I think I might have florets.
Ah, love it. Very good. So you've had your first few shows.
Yeah.
How's the general vibe been? Are people excited to be here?
It's always a slow start, but I had a great kids show in the morning and then followed up by a smaller than usual audience for the adult one, but it was still really good fun. And we managed to, I don't know if you've heard, I levitate a strawberry during my act, so we managed to do that.
I mean, you happen to have a packet of strawberries with you, don't you? You have promised that you can show
almost like planned. I mean, it's not magic, it's all down to lung power. I've got a special strawberry levitating pipe here. And you have to kind of get a really fresh strawberry, pop it on there, and then breathe in. Oh, there we go. I mean, it's much better than that in my show, but...
I mean, where else, Anna Jones, do you get a levitating strawberry but here in Edinburgh? I have to say, aren't you pleased that the Fringe is back?
I've got loads of them here in the studio, actually, I'll have you know, Katie.
Oh, wow.
She judges way too quickly. Anyway, have fun, and we'll check in with you again a little later on. Katie Spencer there in Edinburgh. Thanks very much indeed. Now, let's find out what some of the younger Tory party members thought about last night's leadership programme. Joining me now is the youngest Tory councillor in the country, Harrison Allman-Varty, and the chairman of Hertford and Stortford Young Conservatives, Bailey Nash-Gardner. So, very good morning to both of you. Thanks so much for being with us. We do appreciate it. So, first of all, I want to hear how you felt it went last night for the people that you're backing. Harrison, you're a Rishi Sunak supporter. So, how do you feel that your man did?
I think Rishi did really well last night. It was great to see him in action, and it was also great to see that reflected in the audience towards the end. Is overwhelming support. So I'm glad that came through with the audience, and I think he just oozed competency and confidence, and I'm confident that the more time that goes on, Rishi will do better.
So, competency and confidence from Rishi Sunak, Bailey. Do you agree with that? I mean, the audience at the end did seem to back him. Do you think that it was a good night for Rishi Sunak over your candidate, Liz Truss?
I mean, I feel like Rishi is more slick than Liz. I feel like, you know, he's sort of polished his character. And so, you know, when he's on the TV screen, he's, you know, a bit more presentable. You know, he puts his point across much better. You know, but Liz is improving as time goes on, and I'm sure, you know, if she's elected, she'll have a great team around her to help her, you know, build up that skill that Rishi has, so that she'll be able to do it just as well.
And Harrison, there was a lot of support for Rishi Sunak, as we just said, in that audience. What do you think particularly he was tapping into there?
I think the biggest enemy that Rishi Sunak has is time. I think the more time that goes on, I think more he will get comfortable within the role. I think more people will, you know, like him, really. And so I think for him, it's more just how he can get his point across. And because I think initially when people heard about Liz Truss's initial tax cuts, people thought, oh, that sounds great. But I think when they hear Rishi Sunak's plan, and it's kind of resonating with them a little bit more, and they think it's more proper. So I think as more time goes on, like I mentioned before, I think that'll do better for him.
Yes, and it's interesting to see how much time he has got. Obviously, he's got a few more weeks while people have their ballots, but they may be voting straight away. So it's difficult to know whether he's got time on his side or not. Bailey, Liz Truss was questioned quite hard about this regional pay boards idea that she had. She said she's not going ahead with it, but she wouldn't apologise for what went on. She continued to say that it had been misrepresented. Do you think she handled that well? How do you think she came across with that?
I think throughout the whole debate, you know, she had some pretty hard questions, you know, particularly on the topics of her U-turn on the regional pay. And obviously, I think it was the teacher was arguing that he felt quite insulted. But I think overall, she handled that sort of line of questioning pretty well, you know, stood her ground that, you know, it was a policy idea, it was misinterpreted, and so she decided to no longer continue with it.
So you felt she handled that reasonably well. Harrison, what about this issue of Rishi Sunak and loyalty towards Boris Johnson? There was one audience member who took issue with him in particular, saying he'd stabbed him in the back. I mean, is that going to be a problem as time goes on? There are a number of Conservative members who feel very strongly about this, that he let down his boss.
Well, look, he was one of Boris's closest allies, and it got to a point where he thought enough was enough. It came to more morals, and I think to him. So I think, although it got a little bit, I guess you could say, a bit grisly towards the end, I think it was down to Rishi Sunak kind of not really thinking politically, but thinking about himself and his own morals and how he would act. And I think it's clear that he wouldn't have done the things that Boris did. So I think it was him almost showing to the public, and there's no way really of displaying that until you actually put your money where your mouth is and just, you know, give up the job. So unfortunately, that's where we were. So yeah, and that's how it happened. But you know, going back to kind of what you just mentioned there, and because like I said, I think Rishi performed really well yesterday, and I think when it came to the talking about the pay boards yesterday, I don't think Liz answered that question very well. I thought she should have just put her hands up, said that she got it wrong, because she did. I thought it was quite insulting, especially after a pandemic, to you know, nurses, teachers, doctors, to even have a thought of having some sort of pay cut must be really distressing for them, especially in a cost of living crisis.